I wrote this up actually for the cruising club, and that's the opening line in my story. My opening line in my story it's a quote. I've talked to many people about this, and they all say it's crazy.
We're at the Stonington Harbor Yacht Club. We're interviewing Louis Meyer as part of the oral history program for the Stonington Historical Society. We're talking about people who do long-distance single-handed sailing. And there's a great history in Stonington of maritime activity going back to sailing ships and commercial sailing. Now we've got people who actually go off and have adventures by themselves. First of all, I'd like to hear a little bit about your background, how you got into sailing, what caused you to get interested in this?
Okay. Well, I've always been interested in sailing. It's always seemed a very romantic way to spend time, and has that aura of the past you were talking about. But it's like when people ask me about how to learn to sail. I didn't grow up with it. I didn't start sailing until I was in my 30s and really moved here to Connecticut, and I bought a little boat and kind of mostly taught myself to sail, and I think that's a fine way to do it. I mean, when people ask me the way to do it, I say go buy a boat, because you can do it for a couple of $100 and go sailing whenever you want. So I was at work at the hospital, and I overheard a nurse say she had this little sailboat she wanted to sell, and I said, okay, I'll buy it from you. And came home and told my wife Iris and my two little boys, well, we have a sailboat. And with that kind of captive crew, I'd go out sailing. We kept the boat where this nurse had kept it in New Haven, and I just go sail out into the Sound and sail around and read about it and learn a little bit about it. And 2 years later, I had a 25-footer, and 2 years later, I had a 27-footer, which I kept for 10 years. And on that, I could take some real trips. I could go to Block Island, I could go to Long Island, and I would do that with the family. And one day, actually it was before with the 25-footer, one day I sailed into this harbor just to get out of some bad weather. And I might not consider that weather so severe today, but back then it seemed like a lot. I didn't know much about sailing, and we kind of fell in love with this town. And the next year I bought that 27-footer, and I decided I'd keep it here instead of New Haven. And it was 10 years on that boat, mainly local, really all local. And when I first came into Stonington, there was a boat in this harbor called Spanker, and it was a Pilot 35, and I just thought that boat was perfect. She was one of the biggest boats in this harbor back then. And then after 10 years with the 27-footer, I finally bought a sister ship, and I've had her since. That's now 25, 26 years. And now she's one of the smallest boats in this harbor, which tells you something about what's changed in sailing in general and in this town specifically. But the pilots allowed me to really expand the horizons, because she's a very capable boat. She's small for a 35-footer, but I feel comfortable taking her anywhere. She's a very solid boat. So that's kind of the background.
Great. And then how did you actually start thinking about doing more long-distance sailing?
Okay, so I bought this boat, and she was in South Carolina. And I had her shipped up to Maine, where she was built, and had some work done on her. And then in the spring, I get a phone call from the yard saying I can come get my boat. And I started thinking, I got this boat in Maine, and I'm here in Connecticut, so I guess I have to sail her back home. So me and the two boys go up there and spend a few days sailing around Maine, which was just terrific. and then shoved off to come home. And that was that was a big trip for me. That was the first time I had left the harbor, not planning to go back that night. And I think it's about 300-mile trip, or no, I'm sorry, direct trip from Southwest Harbor down here. It's about a 200-mile trip, and we spent over 48 hours because the wind wasn't. The wind's never right in the Gulf of Maine, it seems. So we kind of headed east, farther away from shore to keep with the wind, and then tacked in to go through the canal, and we just had a great time. 48 hours on the boat, and that started it. So, looking just to keep that adventure going for the next couple of years, I would winter store the boat in Maine and bring it down here in the summer, which is really backwards way to do it. You should be going up to Maine in the summer, I think, rather than going up in the winter, but that's what we did. And you encounter some weather because we're bringing the boat back there in November, and we're bringing it down here end of May, beginning of June, and the boys and I are just getting better at handling more. So that was a really big plateau of sorts in my sailing adventures. And after a couple of years with that, I asked them, I said, hey, how about we take a longer trip? Let's go, I think I said, let's go to Nova Scotia. And they looked at me and they said, well, let's go someplace warm. So I said, okay, let's go to Bermuda. And me and the two boys just sailed down to Bermuda. I had made arrangements with the captain to meet me there in case I didn't feel up to making the trip back. I wasn't sure I was going to like it. And on the way to the boat, I get a call from this captain that he had some medical issue, family issue, and he couldn't make it. So I remember the boys saying, what are we going to do? And I said, well, let's not worry your mother with this, but let's just go to Bermuda and figure it out from there. And we had this great trip down, and I picked up a crew in Bermuda, put a note on and I saw it, a little note on the White Horse Tavern there in St. George, saying a guy looking for a ride back to New England, and he signed on his crew, and my wife came down, and we all had this wonderful week down in Bermuda. And she said, when's the captain coming? And I said, oh, there's captain's not coming. He had some family problem. And she said, well, how are you going to get back? I said, I got Ray DeShields coming with me. And she says, who's Ray DeShields? I said, Ray DeShields? Man, Ray DeShields is my crew going back. And then, she kept pushing me for the answer. I said, he's some guy who's a note in the bar, and he's coming with me. And I remember she looked at me like I'm nuts. She said, I don't know how anybody in his right mind could go to sea with somebody they know nothing about. And I said, well, Ray DeShields is willing to do it. And off we went, and the guy was a great crew, and he's a local Bermudan guy, and I've seen him several times when I've been back down there, and we go have a beer and talk about the trip. But that was the first, extended offshore trip.
And how long were the boys in?
Oh, around 20. Neil was probably 20, Todd 18, something like that. That was 1996. If I could do the arithmetic, I could figure it out. But it was about that. And both boys are good sailors now. Both boys have grown up with it. So that experience allowed me to do a Marion Bermuda race. And again, it was me and the two boys, and a friend of mine who owns a sister ship, and a good racer, a friend of my older boy, Neil. And that was 5 of us on that boat. It was that was pretty crowded, but someone's always awake when you're racing like that. We had 2 people awake at a time, and that was okay. But you know, it's a slow boat. We were kind of end of the fleet. And by the time we got there, some people had already gone home. It just, but I'd heard about this single-handed race. So the next year, I signed up for that. So no, it's 2 years later. 97 was the details don't matter, I guess. But 97, I did the Marion Bermuda race. 99, I did my first single-handed race, the 1-2, and you single hand down and double hand back. So my son Todd, the younger of the 2 boys, did that trip with me, and I loved that. Just loved that race, and the people in it, the whole thing, and the competitors all hang out with each other because there's no one else to hang out with. You have no crew. You can't be cliquish in that kind of situation, and just a great group of guys. So we did that, and 2 years later I signed up again and did it with my older boy, and then I did another one with my daughter, and she did 3 of them with me. And then I did it with her husband, and you know, keep doing these Bermuda races. But the dream of a transatlantic was always there.
So how did you pick the Azores? Was that just part of that dream?
That's kind of you got the standard sailing ship routes and stuff, and the Azores is like the closest landfall if you're coming from the East Coast. It's about 900 miles, I think, off Portugal. So it's very common to head there either from Bermuda, or people go there from the Caribbean, or people go right from New England. So I had set it up for last year's Bermuda race. I did the single-handed race down to Bermuda, and then two friends of mine met me down there, and we were going to head over to the Azores, and we were about 2-3 days out, and we had a medical problem that resolved itself. Everybody's fine, but it seemed the better choice to head back to Bermuda 2 days back rather than maybe 3 weeks to the Azores with this problem. So that kind of squashed that trip because the timing just changed.
So did people find it? I mean, you're actually a day job as a surgeon, right? So did that have some comfort in case something happened?
I don't think so. It wasn't a surgical issue, and you know, it's pretty limited what you can do, and it was something that wasn't really my field at all. So we just kept our fingers crossed and kind of went back to Bermuda to get some expert help. And but then myself and one of the crew sailed back to Stonington, and I still had this plan. So just last June, I set out from Stonington and went across, went to the Azores, and that was my big trip. You know, I wrote this up actually for the cruising club, and that's the opening line in my story. My opening line in my story is it's a quote. I've talked to many people about this, and they all say it's crazy. And that's my brother-in-law Ted talking to me. And the story continues with, well, Ted, how many people that you've talked to about this have actually done it? And he has to say none. And I say, well, then you'll admit you're talking to people who have no idea what they're talking about. So yeah, everybody said it was crazy, except the people I knew who really sailed a lot. And they all said, that's a great idea. You should really do that. And, you know, it's my 75th summer, and the boat's 50 years old, and maybe we should get this done soon if we're going to do it. So off we went. Yeah, it was a great trip.
So in getting prepared, you talked about the boat a little bit. The boat's name is Strummer.
Strummer.
Is there, where does
Oh,
Strummer come from?
that old dog, my favorite old dog. So,
Well, I think that's a good name.
Yeah.
And as a dog person, I think that's real good. So is there anything you had to do extra to get prepared?
well, if you just buy a boat, it's not ready to do an offshore trip. And there are things you should do to do. Now, a lot of boats that are unprepared have done successful offshore trips. There's no question about that. But if you do one of these races, they're very specific in the requirements they want your boat to have. And I've owned Strummer 25 years, and I've always had this dream. And then I've done all these offshore, like the Bermuda passages. So over the years, I've done a lot to the boat, which has made her ready for this. So I didn't have to do much specifically for this trip. It had kind of all been done, but she's got she's got a inner forestay on her mast, so I can rig a storm sail inboard. She's got 3 reefs in the main. She's got bilge pumps that work from the cabin or from the cockpit. She's got, I don't know, I'd have to go down the list, but she's certainly got some, more electronics than you might find in a boat that was just used for day sailing. She's got radar. She's got a wind vane. She's got automatic pilot. It just adds up. More batteries than you'd typically have on the boat, and lots of extras you have to have on the boat. Lots of spare parts. You need a lot of extra lines and shackles, and just things break when you're offshore, and you can't come back and get them fixed. So it's a lot of wear and tear. I mean, a trip to Bermuda, that boat like Strummer, average trip was probably 5.5 days, but that's 5.5 24-hour days, which is way more than most people do in even a couple of sailing seasons. And if you're just going out to day sail, you kind of pick a nice day. There's no point in going out if it's blowing 25, 30 knots. But if you're doing one of these trips, it's whatever's out there. So you'll often find yourself spending a lot of time in fairly heavy weather. I mean, you pick the times of year so you're not going looking for storms, but 25, 30 knots is pretty common. And pretty good seas are pretty common, so the boat gets banged around a lot, and things break.
So the things you're concerned about as you're getting ready to go, is it mechanical? You just talked about that. Weather, and also your own health.
Yeah.
What are the things you worry, or not worry, but you're concerned about as you're saying, okay, I need to be prepared for this? Are those the key ones?
I try not to think about health too much. I'm too old to start worrying about how healthy I am. I'm going to do the trip or I'm not going to do the trip. But, you worry about an injury, because it's easy on a small boat to get injured. A broken rib ashore is really painful, but you can kind of lay low while it heals over the next couple of weeks. A broken wrist isn't necessarily a catastrophe, but offshore, that becomes a real game changer offshore. So you worry about that a little bit, and you want your boat to be set up as safe as it can be for that. A small boat works out well in a way. You can't fall too far in a small boat before you fetch up against something. I've been on some big boats, and they're just lovely when you're at anchor. You've got this lovely room that you're sitting in, But if that boat takes a lurch offshore, you can drop 7 or 8 feet inside that boat before you crash into something. Um, a boat like Strummer, there's always something only a foot away from you, which is not much fun when you're trying to entertain a group of friends, but it's pretty good offshore.
That's practical.
Yeah.
Let's talk a little bit about the trip. How long did the trip take?
22 days from Stonington till landfall, except it wasn't really landfall because when I got there, it was blowing so hard in the harbor that I couldn't get the boat actually to shore. I had to anchor in the harbor and wait another 2 days. That was a bit frustrating after the 22 days getting there.
I think you'd want to, get in and find a restaurant.
That's what I wanted, man. I wanted to sit down in a place that wasn't moving, something like this right here, and have someone serve me a drink and a meal. And I just had to sit out there for 2 more days waiting for that. But that's sailing.
But at the start of the trip was a little challenging as well.
Yeah, the beginning was frustrating. I had lunch right here at the dog watch with my friend Mike McBee, who was one of the crew for the year before, and my daughter Emily, and her 2 boys. And I got on the boat and sailed out of the harbor. Emily was on the launch. She came, took a few pictures, and it was just this lovely afternoon. And I had about 2 days of that, and then the problems started. The AIS, the automatic ship identifier, which is really a great thing to have. It lets other boats know that you're there and lets you know about the other boats. That just died, and I couldn't get that back. One of the GPSs failed the next day, but I had backups on that. The next day, a couple of battens ripped out of the sail. I managed to repair them, and I remember going through the log, looking at the first week, and then I was becalmed for a day, and then the wind picked up pretty severely, and I was hove to for half a day, and then I was becalmed for the next day, and I was really, really getting frustrated. And I've got this satellite communicator. It doesn't give me voice communication. My hearing's not so good, so I'm just as well without voice communication, but it gives me text and email capability worldwide. So I was sending a text every so often I had a group of family and a group of friends that I would text to. And my son Todd picked up that I'm getting pretty frustrated. And he just texted back. He said, "Don't get discouraged, just keep going." And I just settled in after that. That's what I needed to hear. I just settled in after that. And, the rest of the trip, in retrospect, it was an absolutely wonderful trip. It's like a lot of things in retrospect. But I really got into that rhythm, and I really enjoyed being out there. It was a lot more upwind work than I had planned on, and a lot more, a little more difficult than I had thought it might be. I mean, you start a trip like this, you never know. You have to be ready to take whatever comes, and you got to expect it to be certainly have some difficulties and expect some tough times, but it was this nothing too terrible, but kind of constant upwind, a lot of motion, it just nonstop. 22 days of, well, almost nonstop for 22 days of motion. 1 or 2 glorious days under spinnaker where it was really pleasant, but most of it was, while upwind sailing for an afternoon is a lot of fun. But upwind sailing 24 hours after 24 hours after 24 hours gets a little tiring. So I had that, but it was worth doing. This was a good trip.
So then how did you get to relax during the day? How did you get to sleep? Did you have a regular schedule? What was a regular day?
No,
like?
I didn't keep a regular schedule, but one of the great you do whatever you want out there. You know, I mean, that's there are a lot of things that are very pleasurable about it. A lot of things that are kind of miserable, but a lot of things are very pleasurable. For instance, you're on your own schedule. You're very much in the moment. That the only thing that really matters is what's happening right now, because that's the only thing you have any control over. What's going to happen a couple hours from now with the weather and stuff, you have no control over. But what's happening right now, you make your adjustments to the boat to deal with the present conditions. And that's the priority. The priority is taking care of yourself and taking care of the boat. So a typical day is I wake up and I look around. And I rarely would see anything other than water. And you know, I'd make a cup of coffee if I'm waking up in the morning, for instance. Make a cup of coffee and you know, clean up a little bit. Figure out where I am, which now is just a matter of looking at one of the GPSs. I don't have to do the plotting like you used to have to do. I'd write down, you know, latitude, longitude in case all my electronics went out. So at least I could figure out from that point. And then if it's a nice day, I'd sit in the cockpit for a while and I'd read a book, take a nap, do the same thing all over again. I mean, that's how the day went. It was. My wife thinks I'm nuts. She says that does not sound like a good day. But you know, I look at the water a little bit. I read the book a little bit. It's a lot about what's not happening around you too. Is the more I've thought about it. I mean, if I'm around here, I am constantly bombarded with advertising. I mean, it's just always there. Their intrusions are always there. There's noise. There's just a lot of stuff that people didn't deal with a couple of hundred years ago. And you can't escape. You just can't escape today. But you can escape if you put yourself on a boat. I mean, all you hear is the boat and the water and the wind.
So there wasn't a lot of, you didn't see a lot of other vessels, not a lot of traffic?
No, not a lot. I mean, the first couple of days, I saw a few ships. You know, once I'm out past the local traffic and the fishing boats, I saw a few big ships. Maybe I saw 3 or 4 first couple of days, and then I didn't see anything until several days before I made landfall. I saw a few other sailboats. I saw 3 other sailboats. One was a big, like 120-foot, really, you know, one of those beautiful Perini navies, whatever they are, that just zipped past me. And then there were 2 other sailboats about my size that were heading to the Azores. Came real close to me. We were able to yell over each other. They were 2. Each boat had a French guy. I think they were both single-handers, and they were both coming from Martinique and heading over to the Azores. Standard trip.
Well, what about any marine life?
Hardly any that I saw now. Now, I spent a fair amount of time down below, and because Strummer's a very wet boat, and it was all upwind, so I'd go up on deck and I'd immediately get drenched. And after several days of drenching in salt water, you kind of say, you know, I'm going to be spending some time down below with my book. I saw a few jellyfish. I saw some sargassoweed. There was one day when it was blowing real hard, and a whole lot of porpoises came by the boat, and they stayed with me for a couple of hours, and they were just beautiful, jumping out of the water right at the bow, and that was fun. But I didn't see any whales. I tried to catch fish once or twice, but it's so much work to catch a fish that I was just as happy I wasn't lucky. No, not a marine life, but the sky changes a lot, and the water changes a lot. The wave patterns change, and I mean, I was pretty happy to come up on deck and stand there for a half hour, look around, just be outside, and go back down below and read a book for a little bit and come back up. Slept in the cockpit once or twice, but doesn't sound very good, does it? Most people wouldn't like this trip.
It's nice that you had a backup Kindle.
Excuse me?
It's nice that you had a backup Kindle.
Yes, I had a backup Kindle. I had a couple of real books on board. I read a lot. I read a lot of these cop books, these crime books, Michael Connelly and John Sanford books. So I had a bunch of them I read. I read A Gentleman in Moscow. I read Paris in the Present Tense. I read a book about Nantucket. I read a couple of biographies. I read a whole bunch. I'm lucky. I like to read.
So Strummer is still in the Azores?
Strummer is now in Madeira.
Okay.
I moved Strummer after a week in the Azores. I moved Strummer to Madeira. I wanted to get her south because I'm planning on bringing her home in the next couple of months. And you really want to be below, I think, the 37th parallel. I think the 37th might be 35th, to catch the better weather. So Madeira is about 600 miles. No, I'm going to split that. It's about 750 miles southeast of the Azores, right off Morocco. So I brought her down there and left her there with a plan to go back.
Are you going to single hand back?
Yeah, it looks that way. Somebody said, friend said he was interested in doing the Madeira to the Canary Islands trip, because that's my plan. Madeira to Canaries to Caribbean, and then ultimately back home here. So I might have some crew for that trip, but the plan is to single hand back across.
So I have one last question. If somebody came and asked your advice about doing this, somebody who'd never done it, never done a single-handed long distance, just said, tell me what I should know.
You should know your boat.
Or give me some advice on doing it.
Okay. I think, you can just go do it. I think if you're thinking of doing it, you should do it. I firmly believe that. If this is something you think you want to do, you should do it. But before you do that longer trip, you might want to test yourself out with something a bit shorter, like before you do a transatlantic, maybe go to Bermuda. Because that's, you're still putting yourself out there. But you're only really 3 or 4 days from land, pretty much, if you're doing Bermuda. Whereas if you go in transatlantic, you're pretty much 2 weeks, 10 days, 2 weeks from land when you're in the middle. And if you find out you really don't like it, or you're not up to it, you're stuck. So before a transatlantic, I'd say do something a bit shorter, but by all means do it. If you want to do long distance sailing, it's really very rewarding.
And how should they deal with the people who try to talk about it?
Just politely listen and say thank you for your concern. I don't know how to deal with that. What I said here, I wouldn't say to them. Or maybe I would.
But it's just being encouraging and telling them, go ahead. be encouraging and tell them, go ahead.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I don't think anybody should try and talk somebody out of what they really want to do. You know, I just saw the Neil Armstrong movie. I mean, people want to do stuff, you know, and they should do it. Not hurting anybody else when you're doing something like this. So it's an adventure. People don't get enough of that today, I think.
So do you find that when you're talking to other people that do single-handed, there's a bonding that goes on?
Absolutely, absolutely. The 1-2 is a group of people who really you can tell when we get together that we feel an affinity. Yeah, I think very much that's true. It's a little club. It's a little cult. It's a little whatever you want to call it. Yeah, yeah. We understand it. We may not know why exactly we do it, but we know that it's something we want to do. Yeah.
Well, clearly it's worked for you. Congratulations.
Oh, I made it back. Let's see if Strummer makes it back.
Great. Well, thank you. This has been really enjoyable.
Nice talking to you.